Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, like the video, and if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment on if you would want more. This fanfiction was not created by me, but in the description there is a link to the fanfic so you can show your support to the creator and read along. Without any more delay, let's dive into the story.
Inko smiled at Representative Kakaridi as she handed him a homemade snack. He always accepted her snacks after giving a speech. "Thank you, Inko. You shouldn't have." And he always said she shouldn't have. She shook her head. Of course she should have. No matter what he had said that one time, she knew Imoko Kakaridi wasn't Izuku. He had said that to comfort her. He had apologized later, and while Inko desperately wanted his words to be true, she knew they weren't. He was, however, the one man who had made sure that the investigation into Izuku's disappearance was never forgotten. He was the one who made the police chase up any new leads. He was the man who made sure the world hadn't forgotten Izuku. He'd even named a piece of legislation after Izuku. It was dealing with quirkless rights. It was enough to make her cry at times. And when she did, he was someone who would comfort her, silently handing her a handkerchief and making sure she recovered. So how could she not ensure he got little treats and other homemade goods? He lived alone, and as a representative she had no idea if he could cook, or even if he had the time. He could go to the most upmarket restaurants. She knew that, but he always accepted her cooking and he always complimented her on the taste. He was genuine about it as well. If he wasn't, she was sure that after all these years, he'd have found some way to tell her. As a result, every time Representative Kakaridi was giving a speech in her area, or even a little bit away, she was always there with snacks. He'd actually arranged clearances for her, so that she was always close at hand. Inko was realistic. Imoko traveled more than she could, and she knew he was well fed then, but that didn't stop her. He bit into the small muffin. It was specially made to be packed with calories. One of his assistants had told Inko that Imoko's quirk was high calorie. She didn't know what it was, but she made sure she packed as many calories into her snacks as she could. Tazakuri was good as were Quenabori biscuits, but she had found that Western food was sometimes better since it often tasted better cold. She wanted Imoko to enjoy her snacks. "It always tastes so good, Inko," he said, taking another bite. She smiled and handed him another. This one was wrapped in a napkin. He placed it in a pocket and took another large bite out of the first one. Then he smiled at her, reaching up to brush away crumbs. Inko smiled back, and that was enough. She couldn't keep him, and she watched as Representative Kakaridi turned to the crowds who had gathered. That was another thing she liked about the representative. He cared for the people he spoke to, genuinely cared. He always made time to speak to people one-on-one after his speeches, not like other politicians who were whisked away by their security and never actually knew the people they were meant to represent. There was a reason Imoku was one of the most popular members of the House of Representatives. She was proud to call him her friend. That's why she smiled and clapped as he moved on, and she turned with the rest of the group to follow him. Inko had done this often enough that she knew what was expected. Those who were in the support crowd, where she stood, had to smile, clap and look adoring. Imoko had laughed at the description, but he didn't deny its truth. She tracked Representative Kakaridi's suited form with her eyes. He was smiling and shaking hands, and generally answering questions. He looked happy, and the crowd was happy. The world changed so fast. Inko wasn't sure what it was. Someone didn't look as happy. A spike of alarm went through Inko, but she wasn't too concerned. Kakaridi had bodyguards after all. It wasn't until the woman shouted and drew a gun that Inko knew it wasn't just someone who disagreed. "Hero killer!" The scream was audible even over the general noise of the crowd. The woman thrust the gun out. Inko saw the look of concern in Imoko's face. It was all she needed to act. The gun fired, but it was already leaving the woman's hand. Ugh, Inko shuddered. The bullet hit her just a moment before the gun arrived. She staggered, but saw Imoko's bodyguards move. Two barreled into the woman while another two shielded him. She smiled, even as she fell. It hadn't hit him. The crowd screamed, and most ran. Guns were not unheard of in their society, but they were rare enough. They were wise enough to run. Inko! The shout was clear. She felt hands press into her side, covering the wound. Someone picked up the gun. Get paramedics! There was panic in the order, but it was commanding enough that it would be obeyed. Inko looked up at the sky. People crowded around her. She could feel the footsteps through the ground. Inko, look at me. That wasn't hard to do. She recognized Imoku looming over her. His green curls fell over his face, which was twisted in worry. His eyes were wide. They were pained. It's okay, she said. She'd do it again. She'd do it because he looked so much like Izuku, because he gave her hope. Imoku shook his head. Stay with me, he commanded. She recognized the tone. It was the same as when he told crowds to trust him. It carried power, and she felt herself obeying. How long? Imoku yelled, looking up. Inko could see down her body. She could feel the pain dully. It was odd, it wasn't as searing as she expected. She could see her blood on Imoku's suit. He kept his hands on her abdomen, holding the wound. And then he was pushed away. Inko didn't recognize the people, but she knew the uniform. Paramedics. One of them put gauze against her wound, while another put a mask over her face. It was only then, with the feel of oxygen, that she realized how difficult it had been to breathe. There was a rattle beside her, and she saw the leg of a stretcher before she was lifted onto it. Inko looked to Imoku. The man was still standing. Her blood was on his suit. It was shockingly red, and there was a pained look in his eyes. He looked stricken. Inko felt sick. I'm sorry. Is dash. And then she knew no more. A fop. Izuku didn't really see the ambulance leave. He just stared into the area it had been, even as gawkers moved back into the area. There were shouted questions and the flash of cameras. He didn't hear them. He didn't see it. That was Inko in the ambulance. His mother. His real mother, not the fiction Toga was playing. He didn't know what to do. His bodyguards helped him to rise, but he still didn't know what to do. He wanted to follow. He wanted to scream, to rage, he wanted to hurt someone. Izuku spun to glare where the woman had been standing. There was now a gaggle of police there. They had her in cuffs. It wasn't enough. She was staring defiantly at him. Izuku trembled. Sir! You are going into shock. The worried voice was one of his bodyguards. Izuku didn't care. Shock? It didn't matter. The woman was still free. Sir, come this way please. Before he could do anything, his bodyguards crowded around him and herded him towards the car he had used to get here. Izuku shook himself. He couldn't afford to be shocked now, and he could go to see his mother soon. She was in good hands. That would be enough. He stopped moving. Sir, please. It's okay, he said softly, and pushed the wall of men aside. The bystanders had been pushed back by the police, and there was now a cordon. The shouts from reporters began anew as he emerged from the protective wall of his security. He looked around. There was still blood on the ground. Izuku bit the inside of his lip before he cried. The pain of that took the tears from his eyes, and he fished into his pocket, walking to the area where there was blood. Izuku knelt and placed the small muffin there. It looked odd, but he then turned and walked away, allowing his bodyguards to pack him into his car. Let the reporters make what they would of the gesture. He knew what it meant. Once inside his vehicle, Izuku shivered, but he quickly pulled himself together. He hadn't really seen his attacker until it was too late. He'd been thinking about the broadcast from Hisashi Yamada. The man had a new segment and he had featured on it. The segment itself was silly. Who looks like someone else? The suggestion that All Might in his prime was a new Arnold Schwarzenegger was hysterical. At least, it had been once Izuku had looked up the historical figure. But Imoko did not need the phoned-in suggestion that he was Izuku Midoriya. At least the moron who called in the suggestion wasn't Bakugo. That would have been too obvious, even for the group opposing him. He already knew Bakugo was with them, but they had been careful to keep him in the background. Oh, he was in play. His attack on Toga was proof of that. Him applying to Biosimap as a guard was another, and the police could say all they wanted that Kirishima had arrested Ujiko, he knew better. So the caller wasn't Bakugo. But that just meant there was someone else in on the alliance, as he liked to call it. He thought he knew most of them. Mirio was their public face. The boy was running for office in the House of Representatives. He wasn't running in the same electorate as Imoku. They weren't that stupid, but he was running in another and he was reasonably popular. That was Sir Nitai's work. Tomura should have killed him, not just removed his quirk. The man was intelligent, and was obviously the brains of the operation. Bakugo was the grunt. He would do the work that they couldn't be seen doing, and Aizawa was clearly the one they were using to do investigations. The man had skills, but Imoko was equally sure of his skills. Sensei hadn't taught him to be second best, after all. There were others involved. Hisashi was one, and he thought All Might was involved, but the man was never directly seen. There were probably others too, serving roles as needed. Actually, he should probably include Ujiko's arresting officer in on the alliance. He didn't think Shudo Todoroki was in on it, but at the same time, from what Imoku had gathered from the Special Forces officer, Todoroki wouldn't cry if something happened. He wasn't that type of man. So he'd been distracted. Most of the suggestions about those who looked alike had been laughed at. Except his. The reaction to his wasn't as jovial. At least he didn't think it was. He'd been thinking about it, wondering if he'd been overreacting when the attack took place. He could have stopped it. Spark could have prevented the gunpowder from igniting. Maybe. Now Inko was injured, and he was sitting in his vehicle, covered in blood. Imoko looked over at Hesho, his personal assistant. The man was white, but he was functioning. Inform the police I wish to press charges, he told him. And I will fund any charges Inko wants to bring, he added. Hesho nodded, noting it down. Find out who she is, he said, jerking one hand towards the woman the police had in cuffs. It was only then that he noticed the blood covering his hands. Inko's blood. Again Hesho nodded. Sir, we have to get you to the hospital for a checkup, and the police will want to talk to you. Imoku nodded, deliberately working through the problem. Tell the detectives I'm available whenever they need, he said. The sentence wasn't a rote formula, but the answer was expected. Then let's get you to the hospital, Hesho said as two bodyguards got into the vehicle. Imoku nodded. It would be good to see Inko. It was only after they arrived that he realized it was for him. He let the doctors do the tests they wanted. He might be still shocked, but he knew what he was going to do. The concept of mercy did not feature in his plans. A fop. Himiko knew there was a problem when Kurogiri appeared, a bunch of clothes in his misty hand. Come with me, the instruction was terse. She shared a glance with Dabi. The fire villain didn't appear to be any better informed. Someone took a shot at Imoku, the League's warp gate explained. That got their attention. Toga shot up and took the suit. She knew what was needed now. Before she changed, she opened her bag and fished for the right blood vial. She downed it with a single gulp and felt her features shift. Then she put the suit on, and Kurogiri became another gate, which she walked through. It took her a moment to recognize her apartment. This will look more natural, Kurogiri explained. Himiko wanted to argue, but she knew it was true. She gave the mist villain a weak smile. Even when concerned, Kurogiri was still thinking. Just like Imoku. Toga grabbed her mother's bag, the one she used when she was being Imoku's mother, and hurried out of her apartment, closing the door behind her. At the base of the apartment building, she hailed a taxi. It was frustrating having to do that, when Kurogiri could have just put her wherever she needed to go, but it made sense. If anyone questioned things, they would find out she came out of her apartment, which was completely normal. It would be nice when they could dispense with the fictions. She browsed her phone in the taxi and found out what happened. The report said a bystander had been hit. Himiko felt relief at that, but it didn't change the fact that someone had taken a shot at her Izu. The report said the assailant was female. Himiko wasn't happy about that, but it did mean she would most likely have to take care of the woman, because there was absolutely no question about that. The League would not let their boss be shot at. There was a gaggle of reporters at the hospital doors. Paying the taxi driver gave Himiko a few moments to compose herself before she got out. At least this form wasn't well known, and she managed to push past the reporters into the white of the hospital's reception. There she spotted one of Imoku's bodyguards. Mrs. Kakaridi. The call was loud enough to get her attention, but thankfully not loud enough to attract attention from outside. Toga hobbled over to the man, hating the form she had now. At least being recognized meant she wouldn't have to prove to security who she was. This way, please. Imoku is through here. Himiko nodded as the bodyguard led the way. What happened? She asked urgently. Toga had read the reports, but it was better to hear it firsthand. There was a shooter, came the grim response. There was a note of self-blame in the tone. There should be. The bodyguard's job was to make sure there was nothing like that. Imoku didn't notice, but Mrs. Midoriya did. She did something, and was hit. Himiko bit her lip. She didn't know what else to do. Over time, she had gotten Izu's story. How he had been recruited by the League's founder. How he had agreed to be made older, and how he was serving them all and being a representative. She was the only one in the League, apart from Kurogiri, who knew the whole truth. At first she'd liked Imoku because he was older, and he tolerated her. He didn't respond with horror at her suggestions to cover him with blood. He'd simply told her that it wasn't to be his blood. It had been playful, and she liked that. It helped that he wasn't afraid of her like so many others were. He wasn't afraid to tell her to stop. He was great. And he had only become greater when she learned he was actually her age. Probably younger. She was loyal to Imoku before the League. Himiko had proven that often enough. When Izuku had made contact with his real mother, she hadn't known what to think. She'd watched the interactions carefully before she had relaxed. There was desire in Izu's movement, but it was not sexual. It was simply desire which expressed his regret. He still loved his mother, but Toga knew he loved her too. She focused on that. Besides, if she'd have had the type of relationship Izuku seemed to have with his real mother that she thought he had, she'd want to still be around her mother. Inko was a nice woman. A genuinely nice woman. While it wasn't the same, Himiko could see the echo of their relationship in the way Izu dealt with her as Imoku. We're here, the bodyguard said, gesturing towards a door. Toga nodded, and went in. It was a small room. There was a single bed, but Imoku wasn't in it. Instead, he was standing at the window, looking out. I said, I don't want to be disturbed, he growled at the sound of the door opening. He didn't turn. Izu? Himiko whispered uncertainly. He sounded so angry. He turned. There were tears streaming down his face. His green eyes were almost red. That's all she saw before there were strong arms wrapped around her waist and Imoku was on his knees in front of her, sobbing into her midriff. Tentatively Toga placed her hands on Izu's shoulders, rubbing at them. It was what a mother would do. He clung tighter, his entire body trembling. Izu? Toga again whispered after a few minutes. She's dead, he bawled. He took great, shuddering breaths. She's dead, he repeated. For a moment Himiko didn't know who Izu was talking about. Then she realized who it had to be. Inko Midoriya. Toga said nothing. Instead, she reached down awkwardly and wrapped her arms around Imoku. She allowed her knees to bend so that she was sitting on the floor. Izu was practically lying on it, still clinging to her. She's dead, he repeated. They were meant to help her. There was nothing she could say to that. Did she tell Izu that Inko had gone to a better place? Did she tell Izu it was for the best? None of those would ring true to him. If she tried those excuses, Izu would think she wanted Inko dead herself, which was kind of true. There had been times when she'd thought of killing Inko. Himiko never had because she knew it would make Izu sad. Sad like this, and that wasn't fun. I'll have her taken care of, Toga said eventually. Who? Imoku asked. The woman who shot her, Himiko explained. He squeezed her. Toga felt happy at that. You can't, Imoku said, sniffing hard as he looked up at her. It had to be an uncomfortable position. He was lying on his belly, his arms around her, with his head arched up to look at her. Izu released her and pushed himself upright, rolling over so that he was sitting beside her. Himiko took his hand. Of course I can, she replied. She might have wanted Inko dead, but she wanted Izu happy more. And killing the woman who had killed Inko would make Izu happy. No, you can't, he repeated, his voice trembling. He sniffed again, swallowing snot. If you kill her, you confirm the link between the League and me, and that's what they want. He didn't say who they were. He didn't have to. Explodo kill. The former heroes. The list wasn't that long, but it did exist. Toga hissed. She wanted to kill that list. But she objected. They couldn't do nothing. You can't kill her, Imoku confirmed. He pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his eyes. They were still red, and from the way they watered, Himiko could tell that Izu was trying not to cry. Besides, I don't want her dead. I want her in pain, he hissed. Ah, that was something Toga understood. She smiled. It probably looked odd on her older form, but Imoku understood. He got up, off the floor, and held out his hand to help her rise. I want her to scream. I want her to beg for mercy. I want her to bleed. Those were all sentiments Himiko was intimately familiar with. Then I won't have her killed, she assured him. Still no, Imoku said, suddenly cold. You can't do anything against her. I, on the other hand, can make sure that she gets buried in the legal system. Oh, Izu. That's not as much fun. He sighed. It's not, he agreed. But you can't kill her now. You can't touch her now. He took a deep breath, sighing as he returned to the window. Himiko moved with him. I never said anything about later, Imoku added. Himiko grinned. That was the Izu she knew. Just tell me when. She told him, moving close. Imoku wrapped one arm around her shoulder, drawing her close, much as a son would for his mother, and they stood there, looking out at the city. A fop. Her name is Yu Takayama, Hesho told Imoku as he entered the office. Put the file on the table, Representative Imoku indicated. Sir? Imoku had wanted every bit of information that could be collected about the woman who had attempted to kill him, but now he appeared indifferent. Put it on the table, Imoku repeated. Are you all right, sir? No. Hesho jerked at the statement. It wasn't what he expected. The representative sighed heavily. But I will be, he added, turning towards his personal assistant. You have made the arrangements? Hesho nodded. Yes, sir. The funeral details are in your diary, he told his boss. If they were in the diary, that meant Imoku would be attending. Certain events never made it to the diary. That meant Imoku only went to them if he felt like it, or there was time. Anything that made it into the diary was a certainty. Inko Midoriya's funeral was one event. Imoku had actually blocked out the time personally but let Hesho find out the relevant details. "I'll look at her details later," Imoku assured Hesho. "For the moment, make an appointment with Phoenix Wave." Hesho nodded. "Advertisement?" he asked. That would help him with the length of the meeting. "No. Instructions," Imoku told him. The personal assistant felt his eyes widen. Imoku Kakuriti owned Phoenix Wave, which was responsible for a few online news feeds. A few years ago they had focused on heroes, but they had made the transition in post-hero society to other news. Phoenix Wave had various streams of news and print under their control, so that they catered for a large variety of consumers. Imoku didn't usually interfere with them, except to make sure they were charging any political enemies a literal arm and a leg for advertising, while giving him a cost-price deal. "I'll see to it. And organize another public speech." "Sir?" "After what happened, I can't be seen to be cowed." Hesho nodded. He didn't bother to try to argue. It wasn't his job to argue. That was security's job. He just made the arrangements. "Is that everything?" Imoku asked. "Yes, sir," Hesho acknowledged. Imoku nodded and Hesho took that as his dismissal. He sighed when he left the office. Imoku was really taking this hard. He hoped his boss recovered soon. A fop. "Did we do anything?" Sir Night-Eye looked at the message from Mirio. He was actually proud of his protege for asking the question. It was a good question to ask. And the answer was, for once, one that Mirio would accept. "No." He messaged back. Their little alliance with Aizawa wasn't going to be as stupid as to attempt to assassinate Imoku Kakuriti. That was likely to cement his policies. And if they were going to do it, they would have sent someone a lot more skilled than Yutakiyama. The woman was unstable. She was completely unsuitable for any action. Now. In the past, when she was Mount Lady, before the League killed Kamui Woods, he would have considered her for some actions. Her arrogance and vanity were bad, but he could have worked with that. Now. No, she was too unstable. Even so, he was proud that Mirio had at least considered the possibility. It showed that the boy was growing, that he wasn't as naive as he had been. None of them could afford to be naive anymore. "You are sure?" There was accusation in the message. They had promised to tell Mirio everything. That was his price to run for government. "I am sure," he sent back. "You know me better than that." "I wouldn't approve a plan that shoddy," he added. "True." The response was close to immediate. Sir Night-Eye nodded. At least Mirio realized that. But he also realized that they would get some benefit from Imoku's demise. He had thought about it, but they wouldn't get enough benefit. "Should I go to the funeral?" That message was surprising. He wasn't aware that Mirio had been invited. He was aware that Imoku Kakuriti was going to be there. Since the woman, Inko Midoriya, had essentially died for him, using her quirk to attract the gun, and inadvertently the bullet to her, the politician was going. And he had made it very clear that he would fund the prosecution of the woman to the full extent of the law, just as soon as the psychologists declared her fit to stand trial. It was a subtle reminder of his power. Yutakiyama had problems, but somehow the politician seemed sure she would be deemed in a right state of mind to stand trial, not to be committed to some institution for treatment. Imoku was probably going to do something to ensure it. Usually Sir Night-Eye would be happy with that. It would be an opportunity to catch the man in corruption, but in this case it was hard. While the Hero Public Safety Bureau no longer existed since there were no heroes, their workers had been redistributed into other branches of government. Most of the government workers had just switched office jobs, but the psychologists had been divided. Some went into the police, as counselors to cope with the influx of heroes who took positions there. Others had gone into the Justice Department to assess criminals. All Sir Night-Eye knew was that Imoku already owned at least some of those people. He wouldn't be making any calls. The corrupt psychologists would already know what to do from his statement. Or someone else would be making the call for him. There were a lot of options, but none that tied back to Imoku directly. Who did the invitation come from? Sir Night-Eye asked. Since Mirio didn't know Inko directly, it would not be insulting if he did not go, but it would depend on who issued the invitation. Imoku. Ah, that decided it. Yes, you have to go. If Imoku had invited Mirio, then there were a number of possible reasons for the invitation. He could be trying to scare Mirio into giving up his candidacy for parliament by highlighting the dangers. That was unlikely. Imoka had to know Mirio had been a hero and wouldn't be scared off that easily. It was more likely that Imoka was trying to ensure Inko was known. It would look good in the press. And with the press the attempted assassination had given him, Hizashi's segment had been lost. Sir Night-Eye wasn't even sure if Imoka knew about it, but even if he did, no one would be mentioning him now in that segment. It would be too politically insensitive. He sighed. The timing was too convenient. Sir Night-Eye pulled up an image of Yutakiyama on his phone. He examined the woman. He already knew everything there was to know about her. It was rumored that she had been Kamui Wood's lover, but he wasn't sure about that. It seemed to be true, given her collapse after his death, but attacking Imoku was not going to bring him back. Why had she attacked now? Why not earlier? He understood what she was trying to do, though. How did she know that Imoku was the most likely candidate to be the leader of the League of Villains? Who had told her? If it was Bakugo. No. Sir Night-Eye shook his head. The vigilante Explodo kill was tempestuous, but he was not stupid. He would have gone for the assassination personally before he tried to get someone else to do it. So who had made the link? Or had she just gotten lucky? Or Imoku was the instigator of the bills that had seen the fall of heroes, so maybe that was enough for him to be targeted? That made more logical sense. If he couldn't find the link, he doubted she would have been able to. There were too many questions. Imoku Kakuridi seemed to excel at creating questions. One day, he would have the answers. A fop. Katsuki kept his eyes fixed forward. It was the only way he was going to get through this. He ignored the red welt on his cheek from where his mother had slapped him. The argument still echoed in his head. She didn't understand and he couldn't explain it. What do you mean Representative Kakuridi is going to be there? He'd screamed. Mitsuki had looked at him oddly. It's an honor, you idiot. Old hag, tell me what you mean. That bastard can't be there. Are you a moron? She'd screamed back. It's an honor that a man of his stature wants to be there. It's a photo opportunity. He'd argued. It wasn't really. Bakugo knew exactly why Imoku Kakuridi wanted to be here. If there was anything left of Izuku, he'd want to mourn his mother. Except he didn't deserve to, after the pain he'd put her through. And then the lies. Imoku kept giving Inko hope that one day Izuku would return, when the bastard knew it was never going to happen. Why did everything with that bastard Deku have to be so complicated? It was just another reason Bakugo wanted to blast his smug face off. Mitsuki had sighed at his statement. She had trembled, and he could see that she was trying not to cry. I know you don't like the man, brat, she'd said. But you will not say anything. I'm not going. Not if that bastard is. His head had rocked to the side. Mitsuki had slapped him. His father just watched on. He could take hits from villains without flinching. They had nothing on his mother. You are going, Mitsuki had said. And you are going to be polite, brat. Kakariti did a lot for Inko after Izuku. Bakugo could see the way his mother's lips trembled. The way she was biting them to hold back the tears. Izuku going missing had forever hurt Inko. It had hurt Mitsuki as well. It had hurt them all. And the bastard didn't care. He could have come back. Even as the older man, he could have come back. He didn't. He'd chosen this. He'd chosen the League over them. Katsuki had no mercy for Deku. Not when he had caused so much pain. They'd bundled into the car and now he was here. Standing with the mourners, looking straight ahead. Imoko Kakariti was there. He was near the front. His suit was black. It was ostentatious. Black suit. Black shirt. Black tie. The only points of color on him were his green eyes and hair and the dark green cufflinks he was using. He was pale, and accompanied by bodyguards and had taken the position of chief mourner. Hisashi hadn't even fought. The bastard. The man was back for his wife's funeral, but Katsuki had already heard that the man was selling all assets. He wasn't even going to remain in Japan. He wasn't surprised and it didn't change anything. Instead he just stood with his family, deliberately not looking at that shitty Deku as the man went through the motions of mourning. It looked genuine. Katsuki could admit that the motions probably were, but that wasn't an excuse. At least Imoku wouldn't get the chance to visit the Midoriya family grave. Hisashi would take Inko's ashes there. That much the politician couldn't change. Before he knew it, the ceremony was over. Bakugo was grateful for the chance to leave. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep quiet at the tears Imoko kept wiping from his eyes. The man was the cause of so much grief for Inko and now her death. Deku could never answer for that. But before he could storm his way to the car, his mother grabbed him and Bakugo's eyes widened when he realized she was dragging him towards the politician's entourage. No! He pulled back. He could pull out of the grip of villains, yet his mother held firm. You are doing this, brat. Old hag. No. He insisted. She didn't stop. Their argument brought attention and Katsuki felt green eyes upon him. He froze. There was a certain quality to Imoko's gaze that felt heavy. He glared back, daring shitty Deku to say anything. He knew who Imoku was. Imoku knew that he knew. His dare was returned, in the smug smile that shitty Deku gave him. There was a challenge in the politician's face, daring him to make a scene, daring him to step out of line. Katsuki wasn't going to play shitty Deku's game, but he was going to ask some hard questions. He stepped towards the man, but before he got close, someone else stepped up. Bakugo recognized him. Mirio. The candidate wore a nice suit and for a moment that shitty Deku looked confused, before his expression shifted into one of subdued curiosity. I'm sorry, Mirio said, bowing deeply. Imoku frowned. This time, Katsuki sort of understood Deku's confusion. What was Mirio doing? On behalf of all former heroes, I am sorry for Takayama's actions. Katsuki froze. He wanted to scream. That was exactly the wrong thing to do. You didn't apologize to enemies. Even if they had something to do with it and so Takayama's actions were their own, you never apologized. That shitty Deku didn't deserve it. Inko did, but never Deku. Bakugo was forced to watch as Deku leaned over to Mirio, reaching out his hands, and pushing the former hero upright. His expression was one of sympathy, but Katsuki could see the way his eyes were hard. You are not Takayama, Imoku said, loud enough to be heard. You do not need to apologize for her actions, he added. Mirio bowed his head, accepting the words. He didn't see the risk, not in the way Katsuki did. He didn't see the veiled look Imoku gave him, the one that promised pain. He had to do something. Representative. Bakugo called. Imoku's eyes locked onto his. So did Mirio's. Young man? So that was the way fucking Deku was going to play it. As if they'd never met. Katsuki grinned. Oh, Deku was going to regret that. Fucking Deku. You got your mother killed. And you don't even have the guts to come forward. He spat. Bakugo saw the pain flash over Imoko's face before shitty Deku got himself back under control. I think you are very much mistaken, young man. Inko Midoriya was not my mother, he said. The rest of the mourners looked confused. Shitty brat. Katsuki recognized his mother's voice. He made tiny explosions on his palms to keep her away. You're pathetic, Deku. Always have been. Mirio stepped up to him. Bakugo slid away, towards the representative. He wasn't going to be shut down here. Young man, you are distraught with grief, Imoko said coldly. The implication obvious. But Katsuki didn't obey Deku. The bystanders nodded their agreement with the representative. Coward! How could you hurt Auntie Inko that much? He screamed. Mirio lunged at him, strong arms wrapping around him and one hand clamping over Bakugo's mouth. He tried to bite but Mirio held firm. Stop it, he hissed into Katsuki's ear. He wasn't going to listen. Shitty Deku was there. Mourning for Inko as if she was just another follower. He should be on his knees crying. He should be begging forgiveness from all his ancestors, from the world, from Inko. He shouldn't be here, standing there in a neat suit, looking sad, when this was all his fault. He's distraught, Katsuki heard Mirio say, repeating Imoko's words. He tried to shout around Mirio's hand. He tried to struggle, setting off explosions. It was worse than struggling against concrete. He could blow up concrete. Mirio just stood there, taking it all in. I'll take him away, Mirio added. That would be for the best, Imoka said. Somehow Mirio managed to bow, and with Katsuki still kicking, and hitting and attempting to bite and scream he made his way away. Bakugo watched Imoka the entire time. Fucking Deku's eyes were on him and just as his view was cut off by his mother, who was storming behind Mirio, glaring at him, he caught the expression on Imoka's face. It was smug. There was triumph there. He screamed into Mirio's hand. You won't win. Somehow fucking Deku seemed to know what he said because he saw the representative shake his head, green eyes boring into red. The message was clear. Fucking Deku thought he'd already won. Katsuki would show him otherwise. Chosa looked over at his boss. The editor was pale. It wasn't a state he'd seen her in before. She edited one of the biggest magazines in the country. It was one of the few hero magazines that had successfully made the transition to a new normal. As a result, he'd seen her take calls from lawyers threatening legal action, from the police demanding to know who their source was, from the government doing the exact same thing. Chosa had seen her break scandals, romances, births, deaths and marriages. He'd seen her face down everyone without breaking a sweat. Now she looked pale, like death. Who the fuck was that? Chosa asked when she put down the phone. He noted the way she did it. Gently. Like if she was harsh the person she'd been speaking to would know. Chosa watched as Henshaw swallowed. She looked up at him. That was Imoko Kakuriti. Chosa frowned. He knew that name. Representative Kakuriti? That's him, Henshaw agreed. And, he prompted. The man was without doubt the most powerful independent in the House of Representatives. He was up for re-election this year but from the numbers Chosa thought he was a shoo-in. His constituents loved him. What he didn't understand is why Henshaw looked like she'd seen a ghost. She huffed. This is why you aren't going to get anywhere, she muttered. Kakuriti owns Phoenix Wave, she told him. Oh, Chosa murmured. Oh. He understood. Phoenix Wave was their parent company. It was their management which meant that Hero Weekly had transformed into News Weekly and that was mostly due to the policies of Kakuriti. Policies which were very unpopular at the time but had been borne out as successful. Even if he was the one to get the rules changed to make them successful. So what does he want? Chosa asked. Kakuridi hadn't put Henshaw in that state just because he called. He wants us to do an exposé on candidate Mirio Tagata. Exposé? Chosa asked carefully, putting particular emphasis on the syllables. Exposé, Henshaw confirmed. What does he want us to find? Chosa wasn't an idiot. When a man like Kakuridi told them to do an exposé, he was expecting a particular outcome. Though it was odd. He had no idea why Kakuridi might want that. Tagata wasn't running against him after all. Chosa put that thought from his mind. It was above his pay grade. He didn't say, but he did suggest we have a close look at his years in UA. Henshaw took a deep breath. Chosa nodded. UA used to be a popular topic. I'll go pull out the archives, he said. That was the best place to start. They might have something there already. And if they didn't, well, it wasn't that hard to find interesting information. It was all about how you framed it, and if the boss was saying frame it one way, he wasn't going to question that. A fop. Imoka looked over at the vid call. Are you sure about that? Yatarida, the current opposition leader, asked him earnestly. I'm sure, he replied softly, focusing his words carefully. The man sighed. I just can't help but think that if heroes were still around then dash. Imoka helped up one hand. He let his expression shift to one of faint disappointment. Nothing would have changed, he told Yatu. You don't know that, the man objected. And I'll soon be in a position to ensure things can change. That response made Imoka smile. True, but I assure you, nothing would have changed at my rally. Mrs. Midoriya would still dash, he couldn't say it. Maybe a hero could have done something, the opposition leader insisted. Imoku felt a stab of annoyance at the man. Nothing displayed on his expression, but for emphasis he shook his head. He extended himself a little with the gesture. Yatta did trust him, after all. Against another hero, he asked the question sharply. His best work was done with changing cadences and tone. People responded to that almost without knowing that they were. The opposition leader winced. Imoka cocked his head. Everyone is overlooking that. She was a hero, but obviously not a true hero. If she was, then, well, she'd have never been in that position. There are still evils in this world, I know, he said reasonably. But giving people the title of hero just makes them come out more, or just covers up the face of evil, he added, letting the opposition leader stew on that thought for a while. There wasn't much that could be said against that, not with the history that had been dug up just before the vote to reintegrate heroes into society, to take them down from their pedestal. Endeavor was the prime example, but other, lesser examples had been found, and now the former pro-hero. Mount Lady had simply proved the point again. Even Tomura had proven the point, with his story. Tomura would be happy that his history had been one of the final nails in the hero's coffin. Inko wouldn't want things to change because of her death, Imoku continued. So you think it's better to deal with them quietly? Yatu asked. Yes, Imoku nodded. And you know the numbers support me. In the last few years, quirk-related destruction during arrests has been down. For once, insurance premiums actually came down as well. It was only going up with heroes making arrests. Reintegrating heroes into society has saved both money and lives. The stats were very clearly with him. Insurance, especially along transportation routes and in the cities, had gone down because there were no longer heroes wantonly destroying them as they tried to apprehend someone who simply needed some compassion. Crime rates were down, and deaths caused by hero versus villain fights were down to zero, mostly because there were no heroes. The equivalent these days was police versus criminals, and they didn't attract anywhere near the amount of attention. They were planned better and the rates of accidental death were down. So it was still a win there with the numbers. More importantly, confidence in the system was up. In that aspect of governance, the public believed the government had gotten it right. They had gotten it wrong in too many other aspects though, which was why Yato would be the next prime minister. Barring any huge scandal, and Imoku didn't know anything worthy of that. He'd checked. Besides, it was time for a change. Still, there had only been benefits from reintegrating heroes. Yes, but there are still villains out there, Yato objected. Like? Imoku asked, knowing full well what the answer was going to be. The League, the opposition leader told him. Imoku smiled. The League actually proved my point. Did you ever study their dogma? He asked. No. It was to destroy heroes, Imoku told Yato. But I think it was more that they wanted the attention, and to get that attention, they flashily attacked. That's what they really wanted. Now, I'm not saying that they are good people, and I'm not condoning what they did, but since heroes have been gone, the League has been gone too. It was the naive view of the League, but sometimes it was best to explain things that way. Complications just made more complications. They still exist, Yato said defensively. They still exist, Imoku agreed. The police knew it, and the opposition leader was most likely soon to become the prime minister. He would have been included in some security briefings, which probably included the little stunt at Biosimap. And they are still breaking the law, but they are no longer attacking schools, and where they do attack there is a clear focus. The police are now free to pursue them without the public getting hurt, and isn't that what society is about? Not some licensed, costumed individual taking the law into their own hands. Yato took a deep breath. Imoku could practically tell what the politician was thinking. They had been friends for years, after all. He was thinking about the League member the police had caught, who had then been killed by the League. It was undeniably true that while the League member was dead, no one else was. That was a change from the past. Pragmatically, it was the better situation. Heroes are an easy answer. They are a flashy answer, but they are not the right solution for the long term. Living with quirks is the right answer, not holding up some quirks to be more equal than others. The opposition leader caught the reference. His lips twitched. He sighed. I just don't like to see you in pain, he said. And it's obvious to everyone how much you miss Mrs. Midoriya. There was no inappropriate suggestion there. Imoku nodded. She was a great woman. Stronger than most will ever be. The story of what she had gone through had been public news. Yato knew now. But she was killed by a former hero, so reinstating heroes is not the answer. I don't think there is an answer for that. He added. There was no answer Yato could give him. Toga, however, was a different matter, but not now. Not yet. In time. Then Yu Takayama would suffer the consequences. If you are sure. The opposition leader said softly. I am sure, Imoku replied firmly, pushing his power towards the man. He was sure, and he didn't need the soon-to-be government interfering. All right, Yato relented. People wouldn't like it if their insurance premiums rose again. The government budget wouldn't like it either, Imoku pointed out with a smile, knowing he'd won. Yato groaned theatrically. And that's something I'm gonna have to think about. Sure you don't want to be my treasurer? Positive. Independence suits me. He hadn't joined the government. He wasn't about to join a different party, and he'd finally managed to quieten down those rumors that he should start his own party. He did not need others. Well, the door is always open. Even after the election? Imoku questioned slyly. Especially after, Yato told him. Imoku smiled. He always knew he'd be in this position. He just never expected the sacrifices. But this was for the good of all, and that sometimes required pain. He'd gone too far now to turn back, so he would endure. After her sacrifice, he owed it to her memory. A fop. Joho looked up at his boss. You look troubled, sir? I am. The meeting? The boss had been called to a meeting today. One of those meetings that management had to go to, because higher management said they had to. Juho was thankful he wasn't that far up the totem pole. The meeting, came the confirmation. All Juho knew about the meeting was that it had been on and that it was with the highest levels of management. You didn't need higher levels of management telling you to go to it when it involved meeting with the owner. His boss, Atsuna, gave him a look. "You know who owns Phoenix Wave?" he asked. Juho nodded. Phoenix Wave was owned by Kunshu. Kunshu had bought a controlling interest in the company about 15 years back. They had been known as Wave then. The media group focused on delivering hero news. Some parts, like Hero Weekly magazine, focused on the trashy, while they had been Wave's hero newsfeed. And they were good at it. They provided high quality but more importantly, accurate news about heroes. A subfeed, one they sponsored but didn't guarantee, had been the best place to find information on live hero versus villain fights. When heroes had been reintegrated into society, the group had changed their name to Phoenix Wave. It had been an instruction from Kunshu, supposedly from the top, and was meant to symbolize the fact that the Wave group would rise like the phoenix from their adversity. And they had. Hero Weekly had become News Weekly, though it was still trashy. And their newsfeed had changed to regular information, which they actually had spent a fair bit of time reporting on anyway. Now they included things like a traffic report, which was fed by their users. They also carried warnings when any wannabe villain made an appearance. The police usually swarmed them, so it was never a big deal. So a representative from Kunshu was there? Juho asked. Atsuna shook his head. Not a representative. That meant the owner. Imoku Kakaridi himself. Shit. Shit. Atsuna repeated. Juho took a deep breath. It appeared Atsuna wanted to. What did he want? It had to be something Kakaridi wanted that was making Atsuna troubled. He wants us to report on Mirio Tagata, Atsuna replied. It took Juho a moment to remember who Tagata was. Mirio Tagata. Candidate for the House of Representatives. He was young. Younger than anyone else running, and represented a lot of heroes. It hadn't been explicitly stated, but pretty much the entire hero community was behind him. He would probably want to reinstate them. Juho wasn't sure how that would go. He wasn't sure the government would allow it, but if the opposition won, maybe there was a chance. And Kakaridi had been the one to propose the original reintegration bill, or what had become the bill. It had been the then Deputy Prime Minister Kiyoshi Takanaka who had initiated the vote that had actually led to the reintegration of heroes. Well, Tagata is news, Juho said diplomatically. He wants us to report negatively on Tagata, Atsuna clarified. Tagata or the opposition? Tagata. Oh, Juho murmured. Did he give a reason? There is no reason. Atsuna raged. He's never done this in the past. We've built our reputation on being a factual and bipartisan feed. If we suddenly start skewing our feed, people will notice. They will leave us. You told him that? Of course I did, Atsuna said. His reply was, and I quote, "Not if what you report is the truth." That was technically true, but it sounded very much like a convenient excuse. So why does he want this now? As you said, he's never attempted to influence us in the past. Atsuna started pacing. I am frustrated by the very fact that he is asking. Even if we find something damaging about Tagata, the fact that Kakaridi has asked us to report it changes everything. Up until now, I've been able to look people in the eye and honestly tell them that Kakaridi has never influenced our publishing policies. Now I can't. You don't like the implication of corruption, Juho summarized. He was used to this. He had been Atsuna's sounding board for a long time. Most people thought editors and publishers sat above the mere journalists, but Juho recognized it was a partnership. If Atsuna had been less scrupulous, Juho just would have written an article and either found it rejected, or altered to fit the new instructions. No, I don't. And I don't like the control. I get that he's the owner, and that we've been lucky that he doesn't interfere. Yeah, we're not dash. Utsuna gave him a look before he completed the sentence. Indeed. He hasn't interfered, and it is frustrating me that he wants to now. Joho nodded, before he half closed his eyes. How about we look at this a different way? He questioned. Instead of focusing on Kakariri telling us what to do, let's look at what you'd do if Sanoho walked in right now with a damaging story about Tagada. I mean, something really bad, something that would completely invalidate him as a candidate? What would you do? Before or after checking her facts? He nodded. He'd allow that. Sanoho was sometimes a little bit loose with her interpretation of fact. After, Juho clarified. And they are all true, he added. I'd publish. Utsuna declared. Then let's focus on that, the reporter suggested. We aren't just gonna make up crap about Tagada, and Kakariri knows that. So let's see what we can find. Maybe he told you to do it because there is something? Utsuna didn't look convinced, but there wasn't much else he could do. See what you can dig up. Focus on Tagada's relationship with All Might and Sir Night-Eye. Juho gave him a look. Even if he found out that Tagada was bunking either of them, it wasn't going to be much of a story. At least, not against Tagada. It wouldn't look good for All Might or Sir Night-Eye. Not that, Utsuna snorted. Mind out of the gutter, right? Juho gave him a smile. Though, this has got to have something to do with that assassination attempt, he muttered. Utsuna looked at him sharply and Juho could see his editor's mind working. He grimaced. What is it? It's barely possible that Tagada knows the accused. Juho pulled up the file on his tablet. Yu Takayama, former pro-hero Mount Lady, he read. That's not surprising, given Tagada's history, he said, unconvinced that there was any story there. If I'm going to pursue something that obvious, I might as well pursue the rumor that Kakariri was about to propose to Inko Midoriya. That rumor had come up a few years back on one of the news feeds they didn't even consider a competitor. It was a trash feed. Only the most outrageous or scandalous things made it into that feed. Or had. Some idiot had asked Kakariri. The man had looked physically sick at the suggestion, before he looked absolutely livid. And then he'd sued them. They'd actually put up a pretty good defense, and it was rumored that several of Kakariri's political enemies had put up the funds for it. Their defense had admitted that they had reported the rumors, but that they had reported them because that's what their feed was. It was one that didn't focus on news, but focused on rumors. Pretty good really to try to use what they were to defend their actions. It hadn't been enough. He'd crushed them. But never for himself. Not once in the whole proceedings did Kakariri say he was offended. He actually admitted that as a public figure, this sort of rumor and innuendo was to be expected. He sued them on behalf of Inko Midoriya. And now she was dead, having used her quirk to pull the bullet and gun meant for him to her. The rumor mill was going to be going insane again. Though it wouldn't be in public, but that didn't stop people talking. Don't you dare. Utsuna snapped. Tagada probably does know Yu Takayama, but see if there's more of a connection. He wouldn't have dash, Juho didn't finish the sentence. His editor understood his meaning. No, I don't think so, but the others I'm not so sure about. His eyes were on the picture of Sir Night-Eye on his tablet. Juho nodded. He didn't say anything. There had been a lot of emotion involved with dismantling the hero system. Some heroes had turned villainous at it. And some, he supposed, could have been biding their time. They were, after all, only human. And all humans had baggage. A fop. Well, we've got problems. Mirio looked sorry. Katsuki snorted. Who cares? It gives us a reason to go after that fucking Deku directly. And get arrested directly, Sir Night-Eye countered. The former pro-hero and the vigilante glared at each other. There was no friendship there. Aizawa rubbed at his eyes. This is why he didn't like meeting like this. There were always clashes. They shared a similar goal but definitely did not share the same idea of how to achieve that goal. Bakugo would probably be only too happy to confront Imoko Kakuridi directly. The vigilante was usually very realistic about his chances, but with Kakuridi involved, all semblance of reason disappeared. Shoyuta now understood why Katsuki had come to seek his opinion about revealing that Imoko Kakuridi was really Izuku Midoriya. He still wasn't quite convinced of that, given Imoko's reaction to Inko's death. The man had been logical with his reaction to her being shot. If Inko was really his mother, he had expected a more emotional reaction. The man had never cried, and while his gesture of leaving the muffin was odd, it was not. He just wasn't convinced, even if Bakugo was certain. It didn't matter. He'd told Bakugo that they had to bring down Imoko Kakuridi, not Izuku Midoriya. But right at the moment, Kakuridi was definitely winning. Can we do anything to counter the press Mirio is receiving? Sir Night-Eye asked, looking at Hizashi. I'm trying, he practically whispered back, but I told you last time, I'm not a political station. Yet you know people, Katsuki accused. And I'm trying to talk to them. But no one wants to say anything against Kakuridi at the moment. The radio presenter didn't need to say why. With the assassination attempt, the general feeling at the moment was one of sympathy towards Kakuridi. If the shooter were anyone else, I would have said Kakuridi planned it. Bakugo slammed one hand down. Explosions set off. Deku was a bastard, but he wouldn't have done that when Inko was there. He glared at Sir Night-Eye. The older hero looked at him with flat eyes. I wasn't suggesting he did it. Yu Takayama did it, and the current theory is obvious. While it was the government who voted to reintegrate heroes, it was Kakuridi who began the thought process. Or how about we go with the more obvious theory, Bakugo spat, that the bitch worked out that Kakuridi is the head of the league. Sir Night-Eye leant forward, ignoring the explosions Katsuki was still making. If we cannot find the link, I doubt she could. Bakugo huffed. More like she decided it was time to do something. There is no obvious link, Bakugo, Aizawa sighed. Yu Takayama was close to Kamui Woods, and was probably acting due to his murder. Except, why did she act now? It had been years since Kamui Woods died. I think she's been in care, Midnight said softly. Care? Mental health care, the former pro-hero snapped. I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure it has to be something like that, or she'd have attacked earlier. The group nodded. That was true. Though the explanation did not stop the vigilante from staring at Aizawa as if he'd somehow betrayed him. There is a link between Kakuridi and the League, but he is very good at keeping it hidden. I doubt Yu Takayama would have been able to find it, especially if she has been in care. The old guys sighed together, Katsuki muttered. Aizawa stared back. He'd gotten used to Bakugo's glares. I taught Yu Takayama, I have a fair understanding of her abilities. So why did the bitch do it? Couldn't she have fucking seen what would happen? The tablecloth smoldered under Bakugo's hand as he asked. She was pissed off that even though the police know exactly who killed Kamui Woods, Namiri said quietly, nobody is hunting Dabi. That might even be true. The league's acting leader was on very public record as killing the pro-hero, but he also wasn't stupid. The underground of illegal activities was fully functional and almost completely separate from the law-abiding citizens. Dabi lived near the top of the pile, which meant he didn't need to show up very often. And he didn't. Usually he disappeared by the time the police could respond. There were bad areas that they just didn't like to report to. Politicians denied those areas existed. They took great pains to make sure they went to them in daylight. And, while no one could prove it, Aizawa was sure the villains made great pains to ensure nothing happened to the politicians. There was always some rogue who would try something. They didn't need that. They needed the illusion of normality, and they were smart enough to enforce it. None of that had to do with Imoku Kakuriti. You knew she was going to do it? Aizawa asked quietly. Namuri shook her head. No, she replied urgently before someone could berate her for not stopping the other former pro-hero. But if I had to give a reason, I would say that's the one that tipped her over. Fucking bitch, Bakugo growled, though it was unclear who he was referring to. Can we capitalize on what she said? Sir Night-Eye asked. Hizashi shook his head. I told you, no one wants to say a thing against Kakuriti at the moment. How long will that be for? The radio presenter just looked at Sir Night-Eye. The statement didn't need to be said. There was no way to know how long it would be, but they could be sure that Kakuriti would milk the situation for as long as he could. It's tragic, yes, but she was a bystander, All Might's former sidekick said. Actually, she was on his campaign team, Hizashi told them. And there is a lot of sympathy for her given the challenges she faced, therefore there is sympathy for Kakuriti. Sir Night-Eye huffed. We have to prove the relationship between Imoku and the League, Aizawa interrupted before they went around in a circle again. We are sure there is one? Midnight asked. Positive, Bakugo growled. Fucking Deku is their goddamned hidden boss. I suspect he has been well trained. We believe that Tomura was the all-for-once chosen successor, but if it is this Imoku Kakuriti, then he will not be leaving obvious clues, All Might spoke. The man had been listening up until then and Aizawa was slightly surprised to hear the serious side of the man. It was nicer than the jovial nature he used to project. Then we go after the non-obvious clues, Sir Night-Eye indicated. Bakugo gave him a look before shaking his head. He remained silent, though to Aizawa's eyes, there did seem to be a smug air to his stance. The League's supplier? Yagi asked. Is about as slippery as the League, Katsuki supplied. That was reasonable. The man dealt in the underworld and while to be a supplier, he had to be contactable, he was not stupid. The gathered group knew the man, Jiren, had been supplying the League for at least the last decade. To survive that long in the underworld, he had to be careful. I tried to find him, to get to Dabi, but I'm having to go another way now. Bakugo growled. Another way? Yagi asked. Katsuki grinned, holding up one hand which he balled into a fist. A more direct way, he said. Fighting, Aizawa murmured the explanation. You are in the fighting rounds? Mirio asked. It's not like they know how to fight, the vigilante dismissed the question. Which one are you in? Mirio pressed. Osaka. Too much risk in Tokyo. So how does that get you to Dabi? The candidate seemed confused. Bakugo glared. Dabi runs all the underground fighting rings, he snapped impatiently. You win enough in any of them, you get promoted to Tokyo and the chance to take on the champion. I don't give a flying fuck about that, but when I win Osaka, I get an invite to see Dabi. Mirio nodded for the table. It made rather sickening sense. You're sure they won't recognize you anyway? He asked. Haven't yet, Bakugo shrugged. They knew what his response would be. He'd just fight his way out. At least that's what he'd try. The table knew better than to try to convince the vigilante out of his plan, and truthfully, if what he said was true, that'd he'd get an invitation to see Dabi if he won the Osaka bouts, it was the quickest, most direct way to the acting leader of the League. Tell us where the meeting is, Sir Night-Eye murmured before he looked around. I've been looking into Kakuriti's companies. His employees have a very high sense of loyalty. Of course they do, Katsuku snorted. They are quirkless losers. The sentiment wasn't one that was shared at the table, given that two of them were quirkless, but it was one that was in the community. It wasn't everyone, but it was a large enough view that persecution was rife. Imoku Kakuriti's policy of only hiring quirkless had done him no favors in some areas, but in others, it had gained him loyal supporters. 50% of those in his electorate indicated they would vote for him. Outside of his electorate, most quirkless people would vote for whichever candidate Kakaridi endorsed. Well, they aren't talking, which means I can't find out much about Kakaridi's finances. What about the tax department? Mirio asked quietly. They won't investigate without a reasonable suspicion, Yagi explained before Bakugo could say something. And according to them, Kunshu and all subsidiaries are above board, and paid up on their taxes. They have to be, to hold government contracts, he added. There's no conflict of interest there? Toshinori sighed as he shook his head. Kunshu is never directly involved, and Kunshu is the company Kakaridi owns. Those holding the contracts are usually 3 to 4 companies removed from him. That's still conflict of interest. Bakugo hissed. Not when each company reports their results independently, Sir Night said. He'd looked into this as well. According to the government, that makes them independent, and Kunshu is simply the majority shareholder. And Kakaridi has listed every share he owns on the register. He's declared his interests and he remained out of the selection committee when it comes to Biosimup's carry contract. It could still be reported. There is no scandal there, Hizashi said tiredly. He really didn't want his program to become political, but he could see that he might have to insert some things into it. His producer would want reasons and it would bring Kakaridi's attention. The former pro-hero wasn't afraid of a fight, but the representative didn't fight in the same way they did. He was used to the war of words and reputation. They were used to more physical confrontations. They had to find some leverage, and obvious things like conflict of interest was something newbie reporters were put on, and Imoko had done everything by the book. Following the money is the first rule of tracking down crime, Sir Night said. I have followed the money. It is all accounted for. It's fucking not, Katsuki growled, letting small explosions hit the tabletop again. We know it's not, Yagi said, placatingly. But the books are in order. At least the public ones are, and we aren't going to get access to the real ones, he added. That leaves us trying to find other clues, Midnight said. Bakugo shook his head. It was obvious he was rethinking working with them. If I could get Jiren, I could get one of the League. And we saw how well that went, Sir Night said. Katsuki roared at the dig. At least I did something. He yelled. At least you killed someone, the former pro-hero corrected the statement. Bakugo snorted. If the police had done their fucking job, he growled. They all knew what had happened. Ujiko had been killed by a disguised toga while in a holding cell after having been brought in by Kirishima, who pretended to have captured the League member. Should we bring in someone from the police? Sir Night ignored Bakugo with his question. Who? Aizawa asked. He had several candidates, but he was curious to know who the others thought might be practical. Endeavor's son is a capable young man, Mirio said. And Wood has a reason to join us. Half and half? Bakugo snorted. You want to ruin his career like yours? Mirio said nothing at that, but he was offended. Bringing him in would provide legitimacy. Katsuki shook his head. Without proof, legitimacy doesn't matter. That was true. At the moment there was no real reason to bring in one of the heroes who had gone into the police force. All they would be doing was risking their career. It would be too easy for Kakaridi to get a look in here. It didn't matter how discreet they were, and they had taken pains to be discreet. Bakugo hadn't even come in the front door. He'd come through the roof so that no one had seen him enter this room. But it was a risk they couldn't take. Then where are we getting the leads? Mirio asked. He might accept there was no need to bring in someone else yet, but they had to be getting somewhere. You said yourself, Jiren is as slippery as any member of the League. We've seen what happens when we dash. We? Bakugo growled. He was responsible for the capture of Ujiko. When we, Mirio repeated, get a member of the League into custody. None of his business associates are willing to speak, so who else is there, who might be willing to reveal the truth? What about the League's associates? Sir Night-Eye mused. Jiren? Hizashi asked. They just mentioned Jiren. Not Jiren. The others. Those who made those abominations. They are dead, Katsuki announced. He glared at Sir Night-Eye. I've been after this fucker for years. Deku was useless, not stupid. Then what about other more personal relationships? Mirio asked. Such as? Midnight asked. Girlfriend? Doesn't have one, but Kogu answered. Family? Mirio suggested. No siblings, and only his mother is still alive, Aizawa replied. But she is hard to get a hold of. What do you mean? Katsuki was curious. Exactly what I said. She's hard to get a hold of. She's very rarely in her apartment. The detective could see the cogs turning in Bakugo's mind. He could see that they had already turned in Sir Night-Eye's. I haven't approached the woman, he added. It could be construed as harassment, he explained, giving Katsuki a sharp look. The vigilante snorted. Little things like that still didn't bother him. Aizawa wondered what it would take to make Bakugo take it seriously. Was there anything else? Sir Night-Eye asked pointedly. I doubt we'll get anything out of his mother. Nothing linking the League to Kakuridi at least, he explained. Yagi nodded. Then what about someone else in the underworld? He suggested. Not one of the League, but someone else in the underworld. They don't know anything, Bakugo grumbled. I'd beaten the shit out of enough of them to know that. Some know that the League supposedly has another leader, but as far as they are concerned, Dabi is the League's boss. Aizawa looked at Yagi, his eyes narrowing as he remembered something. How did you track down All for One in the past? He asked. After heroes had reintegrated, and after Kamino more information about that particular villain had come into the light. He has been the boogeyman of the underworld. A rumor, a shadow, but All Might had known he existed, and had pursued him. We tracked a lot of things, he said. Money. Rumors of unusual or powerful quirks going missing. Scientists. Sometimes informers and... The former number one hero sighed heavily. Beating the shit out of some of them, he admitted. Bakugo laughed. It's different this time though, Yagi warned. All for One was more hands-on. Kakuridi seems to be more comfortable acting through others, and remaining hidden. It was an odd thought, given that Kakuridi was a member of the House of Representatives. He didn't appear to hide anything, except his connection to the underworld. So where does that leave us? Mirio asked. That was the question. Katsuki's red eyes turned towards him. Is anything they are saying false? Saying? The papers, Bakugo clarified, will ill grace. He meant all the bad press Mirio had been getting lately. A lot of it is accusing Mirio of being too young, Namiri said. She remembered reading it and wincing because there really wasn't much argument that could be made against it. Mirio was young. At 30, or was that 31, if he won, he would be the youngest representative ever. Even Kakuridi had only begun in his late 30s. So we capitalize on Mirio's youth, Sir Night-Eye said with a shrug. We have to show that youth is not a bad thing here. It's one of the reasons we chose his electorate. It has a younger population. What are the opinion polls? They are close, Hizashi said. His station may not be a political one, but he knew about these things. What else are they saying? They are pointing to mental instability in the wake of League's attack that took my quirk, Sir Night-Eye said. Aren't those assessments meant to be confidential? Hizashi asked. He'd been wondering that for a while. Mirio sighed. They are, but when I applied to be a candidate, they had to be disclosed. Bastard, Katsuki muttered. He already knew who had made that bit of legislation. Deku probably believed he'd thought of everything. There had to be something he'd missed. Sir Night-Eye looked to the side, thinking. The reports have been careful. The trashier magazines and feeds are reporting the more outrageous stuff. The more conservative feeds are being more careful. Do you mean to tell me that everything is true? Namuri asked, her eyes wide. What I have seen has enough of an element of truth, Sir Night-Eye admitted. The dropped excessive force charge? Hizashi asked. It was borderline, Sir Night-Eye defended Mirio. The love triangle at UA? That what? Mirio burst out. Katsuki chuckled, but he recognized the significance of Mirio's outburst. So that one isn't true? Aizawa asked, laconically. Which one is reporting that? Namuri asked, interested. That trash feed AL. Bakugo wasn't the only one to pull out his phone. A few moments later, quite a few people were chuckling. AL, which stood for Analyze Life, was a trashy feed full of scandals, a few which might even be real. It says here, you are in a love triangle with Nijire Hato and Tamaki Amajiki. And at least part of the reason for your breakdown after Sir Night-Eye lost his quirk was that Nijire had told you she preferred Tamaki but that she had regrets so that none of you are together, and happy. What? Mirio gasped. The relationship started back in UA. That's not true. Mirio was affronted. So it's something we can use to fight back, Aizawa said. Who owns AL? Phoenix Wave. Surprisingly, it was Yagi who answered. Which is owned by Kunshu, which is owned by Kakuriti. Could Mirio sue them for libel? Midnight asked. We could, but it wouldn't get back to Kakuriti. At best, Phoenix Wave would cut AL loose. And AL lives to be sued. The more lawsuits they have, the closer to the truth they believe they are. They use them as advertising. The only way to get Kakuriti on this would be to find an email, or a message or something from him telling them to ruin Mirio's reputation. There were a couple of glances towards Bakugo after that. I'm a vigilante, not a fucking thief, he snapped. And I tell you, there won't be a record of it. If fucking Deku did to it, he would have done it verbally. So one of the editors could testify to it. Why? Sir Night-Eye asked. For them this is just business. We need something solid. The word of one magazine editor, especially one that comes from a disreputable feed, is not going to be enough to bring down a representative. There is a way, Bakugo said. I could just fucking take him out. That's murder. It solves the problem. Then, as far as I can see, Deku is just gonna walk all over you lot, he declared. Aizawa huffed. They were in a bad situation. There had to be something they could do. He leaned forward. Katsuki is most likely correct, and there will be no evidence of Kakuriti giving any instruction to be negative towards Mirio. We should concentrate on those things that are likely to work. Taking him out? Bakugo sniped, but Aizawa knew this time he was saying it to be deliberately annoying. Thankfully Sir Night-Eye recognized that as well. Following the money. Aizawa countered. The books look legitimate now. We know they aren't. So let's look back in time. There has to be something there. No one is a perfect villain when they first began. So let's get a timeline on him, and then trace the cash. The former pro hero looked at Toshinori. You believe that Kakuriti is one of All for One students? He asked. Yagi nodded, his eyes grim. It was paining that the old villain was still causing problems. Then if he was anything like Tomura, there will be some early mistakes. We saw Tomura get better over the years. I think we missed Kakuriti because we were focused on Tomura. Let's find those early mistakes he made. The money, Sir Night-Eye nodded. I'll look into the books from the time when Kakaridi took over Kunshu. If there's going to be a mistake, it will be then. Katsuki rolled his eyes. I'll make sure the league remains hidden, he said sarcastically. It translated to you would do what he'd been doing anyway, which was breaking the law and generally getting away with it. It went unspoken that he'd try to capture more league members. Maybe one of them would speak before they were taken out. Maybe one of them knew something they shouldn't. Hizashi sighed. I'll see what I can do to counter some of those rumors, or at least lessen their impact, he told Mirio. Thank you, the candidate said. I'll see if I can get any government documents about Kakaridi. I'm not a representative yet, but most of the parties were trying to attract me. They still are? Some have backed off, but some are still going about it. I'll see what they can give me. Do that, Aizawa encouraged. I have some business contacts, Namiri said. No one within Kunshu, but I know a couple of the advertising directors for a couple of the feeds. I'll see what they have to say about Kakaridi. It was possible one of them knew something. The group nodded, but they were aware that they were still facing an uphill battle. Heroes, they'd never backed away from a fight. They wouldn't fail now. Namiri's contacts hadn't been able to give her much on Kakaridi. Most of them had never met him, and those that had really didn't have anything incriminating to say. The man was their boss, nothing more. He occasionally came in to approve a particular advertising campaign, but for the most part his duties as a representative took precedence. They all reported that Kakaridi wasn't much involved with the companies he owned. He ran Kunshu, and allowed Kunshu to run the other companies. But one of her contacts had whispered something to her about Biosimap. It wasn't about their carry program, but about something before that. Biosimap made sleeping pills that they claimed were derived from natural ingredients. The mag had tested the pills and agreed they were natural ingredients, but they had found something else. They had isolated what Biosimap claimed was a quirk-based ingredient. It was only found in the high-end sleeping pills. The lower-quality ones used a synthesized variant. Her source had wanted it investigated further, but no one ever did, except for now, when there were people asking questions. Namiri had tried to find out who else her source had told, but he'd shrugged, and told her he'd given the information to anyone who asked. She'd focused on the information after that. Who else knew only became important if she had something. By itself, the incorrect listing wasn't anything that bad. What made it noteworthy was that the ingredient wasn't actually registered. Not properly anyway. The registration had holes in it. It wasn't like someone had forgotten to sign a page or something. The source had not been filled in on the registration. The source always had to be filled in to ensure that they were being properly compensated for their contribution. The fact that the source wasn't listed was odd and could mean a few things. 1. The source wasn't actually a quirk but was something Biosimap had synthesized completely. That would cause a bit of a scandal if true. The testing regime on a quirk-based drug was different for that on a laboratory-created drug. If Biosimap had listed the compound as being quirk-based when it wasn't, they could be in trouble for that. Another possibility was that the source wasn't one they wanted to admit to. And that, with Biosimap's link to Kakaridi, could be a link to the League. Her contacts told her they believed the compound was quirk-based. Through the years, they had made several observations that lead them to that belief, but Namiri wasn't interested in that. She was interested in the fact that they had managed to confirm that a young man with light brown hair made a biological delivery each week. It was a smallish canister. The routine was so established that he simply delivered it to the receptionist, who handed over an envelope, and he went on his way. Apart from the fact that it was a completely improper way to accept what was a potential biohazard, Namiri was interested in the description. He sounded like mustard. And wouldn't that be interesting, if mustard was producing the quirk-based ingredient Biosimap used? It would provide a direct tie between Kakaridi and the League, though Namiri was not so blind to realize it would be that easy. Kakaridi could claim he didn't know. But if they could tie Biosimap to the League, then that would cause problems. She sighed. They had enough information to cause Kakaridi problems but nothing big enough to bring him down. It was getting to the point when they should just release their information. Giving him problems was not their goal, but at the moment, it might be all they were capable of, and you never knew which problem would be the one to snowball into the one that did bring him down. That's why she was following the young man who had made the delivery this week. If not for the missing teeth, he might have been called handsome. He had several tattoos on his forearms, but she couldn't see much more. He'd taken the envelope and shoved it into his pocket before leaving Bio-Simup. Then he'd walked back to a train station. That much had been easy to follow. She was sitting in an adjacent carriage watching him through the glass. He was tapping at his phone. Namuri was pretending to read hers. Finally he got up. She was surprised. It was a good neighborhood. Working class but not lower working class. Middle working class. The young man walked out of the station, confidently strolling down the empty roads. It was an older part of town. They were narrow. You could fit one small car down them. They were mostly for walking. She wondered if he'd lead her here deliberately. At this time of day, the suburb was empty. Still, for all that many thought her a one-trick pony, Namuri had been a fully fledged pro-hero. She could convincingly follow someone, even when there were no crowds to hide behind. It just required the ability to pay attention to your surroundings. The man didn't look back often, but when he did, Namuri was always out of sight. In the inset of a narrow walkway, around the corner of one of the tall garden walls, behind some bins that had been left out to clog up the available space. It wasn't glamorous, but it got the job done. At least, that's what Namuri thought until the man turned a corner, and she then heard his feet plead against the ground as he ran. She swore, and took off after him. Thankfully she was close enough that she didn't lose him in the rabbit warren that was the suburb. Instead she ran straight into his trap. It was a cul-de-sac. He stood at the end. Pink gas surrounded him. Namuri ran into it, and breathed it in before she realized what had happened. Mustard. She gasped the identification. The bastard grinned at her, looking up, and she could see he had a thin mask over his face. It wasn't the old-style gas mask he had worn when he was younger. This was something new, more modern. It did the job without being anywhere near as bulky. "You should be asleep soon," he told her casually. Midnight nodded, and then staggered. He took a step closer. She leaned against one of the fences, her hands steadying her. And then Namuri felt her legs collapse. She folded them under her. He chuckled and moved in. Just what she had been waiting for. She hadn't collapsed without a purpose. Instead, she was resting on her feet, and Namuri lashed out now, spinning to sweep Mustard's legs out from under him. He went down cursing, straight into a quagmire of the compounds her quirk allowed her to make. Namuri lunged at him, reaching for his gas mask. Mustard wasn't a large man, but he was fit. Thankfully she hadn't let her training go to waste, and one thing no one really expected with her theme was for her to be a grappler fighter. But really, grappling was just another position for sex, and she was expected to be proficient there. It was an interesting thing when those who created compounds fought. Namuri was affected by Mustard's sleeping agent, but after so long of making her own, she did have some resistance. She wasn't sure if he did. He always seemed to wear a mask, indicating that he may be susceptible to his own creation. Namuri hoped he was. She might pass out for a little, but she should wake up first. And then she could capture him. She got her fingers under his mask and then allowed Mustard to push her off him. His mask went with her. Namuri rolled on the ground, gaining distance, but she still heard him gasp. "Two can play the sleeping game," she told him as she rose. Mustard snarled at her. Namuri tried to breathe lightly as she directed her quirk towards him. He recognized the gesture and made his own. She felt her chemicals pushed away, but Mustard raised one hand, holding it over his face. "Is the little boy feeling sleepy?" she mocked. She wished she had her whip. If she did, then she could have pulled him over. Bitch, he growled, and Namuri was surprised when he lunged at her. Despite the years, there wasn't much information about Mustard's fighting style. He tended to hold back and let his gas take care of his enemies, but he was known for carrying a gun. Namuri examined him, tossing the mask away as far as she could. She couldn't see a gun, but it was something to be wary of. You are just like those morons. The world pandered to you because your quirk was good but still safe. Mustard swung at her. It seemed slow. She tried to hit him back, but Namuri knew her reaction time was compromised. They both ended up swinging wide and staggering like two drunks. Except, the fact that Mustard could move meant he also had some immunity. This was not going to be fun, in any sense of the word. She had been trained to fight under the influence of drugs. It was in the third-year curriculum and was meant to help if you were ever targeted or kidnapped. Namuri wasn't sure if it really helped, but at least she was still on her feet. They took another few swings at each other, staggering when they managed to connect, but Namuri could feel her eyes growing heavy and her thoughts were logy. She couldn't last much longer. Thankfully, Mustard appeared to be in the same boat. The villain was obviously stronger now than he had been. He glared at her, and then staggered away, weaving his way back down the cul-de-sac. Midnight considered following, but it was all she could do to keep her eyes open. This time, when she slumped against a fence and her legs collapsed under her, it wasn't a ploy. She kept her eyes on Mustard. He went through a gate, entering the tiny front gardens the houses in this area had. The gate closed and she collapsed. She barely heard him collapse before sleep dragged her under. A fop. Dabi made his way down the road. He didn't like visiting Mustard. The League member lived too much in society for his comfort. The surrounds were proof of that. The houses weren't mansions, not like the traditional house he'd grown up in, but they weren't small. These houses belonged to those on the upper end of comfortable. They all had gardens and high fences, but the houses looked over those fences and judged him. To say nothing of the rabbit warren the twisting streets were. He always felt exposed here, despite everything closing in. Still, Mustard was correct about one thing: at this time of day, he almost never ran into anyone, so from that point of view, it was safe enough. There were cameras on a lot of houses, but so long as no one stole anything, there was no reason to look at those cameras. Still, he was cautious and made sure he wasn't being followed. That was routine, so as he walked, Dabi thought about what Imoko wanted. Killing Explodokill was something the League wanted, but it wasn't like killing a villain. The vigilante didn't follow a routine. Though maybe. Dabi frowned, thinking about what he knew of the man. Explodokill was a childish name. It reflected his childish nature. He had been enrolled in UA's hero course, and had failed the first round of mandated psyche testing. After that, he'd just never shown up to the general studies course, and that was when people lost track of him. He wasn't in the underworld. Dabi had checked, though he had been around the fringes. So who was his supplier? That was something to ask Jiren. The fire villain nodded. And if the vigilante wouldn't play ball, then there were other ways to make him. Explodokill still had family. Dabi felt his scarred skin stretch in a smile. It wasn't honorable, but the League were villains and it was time to remind the world of that. Taking out a vigilante's family would send a message. And Imoko had said they could go wild against Explodokill providing the vigilante died. Dabi wondered what Imoko had against the man. Nothing sprang to mind. He snorted to himself, nothing would spring to mind. The boss was very good at hiding his desires and his past. Dabi wasn't stupid. He had looked into Imoko's past as much as he could. There wasn't much to find. There wasn't meant to be much to find, and everything he did was legit. Over the years, while it was like pulling teeth, he'd managed to extract some information from Kurogiri about Imoko. The warp villain was ridiculously loyal. Just like Toga. But Kurogiri confirmed that Imoko had been set up in the system by the old man. He ran the League's legitimate businesses, and paid the League. At least he had, until he turned the League into its own business. Very successful businesses too, Dabi was forced to admit. Mustard worked once a week and made enough to live here. He worked more, but he had Inumus and had gone into a more underground business. With the reintegration of heroes, the public was not able to see villain versus hero quirk battles on a daily basis, and to compensate, quirk-based fighting rings exploded in popularity. There were some legit ones, but they were wussy. The ones that were really popular were the underground rings. He was at the center of them all, and actually ran several levels of quirk fighting rings. The rules got harder, as did the fighters as you moved up the ranks. The final champion was the Numu high-end. The creature loved to fight, and the harder his opponent the more he loved it. Dabi loved high-end as well. There was a huge winner's purse for anyone who could defeat the Numu. He'd never had to pay it out. But that was beside the point. There wasn't much to learn about Imoku, and even when Dabi took Toga's pet name of Izuku and looked for information, there was even less. He had managed to make the connection between Imoku and Izuku Midoriya. Imoku looked exactly like a much older Izuku, but was that really possible? Not the aging. Dabi knew that was possible, but the knowledge and the rest of it. Could Imoku really only be about 28, in which case, how the hell had he managed to run the companies and be a member of the House of Representatives at 16? That bit beggared belief. But if it was true, then that would explain the connection between Imoku and Explodokill. The two of them had supposedly been friends. Friends. Not that good a friend if Imoku wanted the other man dead. Dabi shrugged as he neared Mustard's house. He'd think about it later, and maybe he'd even just ask. Given that Explodokill had taken out twice, and captured Ujiko, the League didn't need any more reason to kill him. But it would be nice to get to know the boss a bit more. Dabi stopped. His nose twitched. He knew that smell. You work with a man for more than 13 years and you learn what his quirk smelled like. Mustard had been using his in the street. But it wasn't his quirk alone. There was something else mixed in with it. The smell was subtle, but Dabi had practice. He also knew that this toxicity wasn't enough to affect him, but he still pulled out a mask. It was better to be safe than sorry. The League still carried their gas masks. It was good practice and a defense against more than just Mustard, and if nothing else, it doubled as a regular mask to hide his identity. Dabi looked around carefully. He couldn't see anyone and he couldn't feel anyone, but before he moved forward he palmed his phone and messaged Kirojiri. He waited for a reply before he walked further, cautiously towards Mustard's house. The gas grew thicker, but he could tell it was dissipating. Mustard lived in a cul-de-sac. Dabi knew that and so peeked around the fence of one of the neighbors to check the coast was clear. He hadn't expected to see a woman slumped against the fence a little way into the road. She had tried to keep herself upright but had fallen and was now asleep. At least Dabi assumed she was asleep. He examined her carefully. Here was a good place for an ambush. Her eyes were closed and her hair was black, but there was something familiar about the spiky tufts. He was sure he'd seen her before. Dabi's eyes narrowed as he continued to examine the street. He couldn't see Mustard, and if he'd gotten into a fight and had managed to subdue the woman, then why was she still on the street? He looked to the gate that led to Mustard's house. It was closed. Dabi examined the bottom of it but couldn't see anything underneath it. Then he looked back at the woman. She hadn't moved. That was good. Those who were pretending to be asleep often liked to shift and murmur things to enhance the illusion, except it broke it. People stayed still when they were asleep, and under the influence of Mustard's quirk one didn't go through the dream phase, which might allow some movement. Either the woman knew what she was doing, or she was really asleep. Given Mustard's quirk, the latter was most likely true. Dabi examined her again, looking at her face. He still thought he'd seen her before. It was a long time ago, back before the integration of her midnight. Dabi felt his eyes widen when he finally placed her. What the hell was Midnight doing here, passed out in the street near Mustard's? Well, that was the explanation of itself. But where was Mustard? Dabi brought his phone out again. Has Mustard messaged you? He sent to Kurogiri. No. The reply was quick. The answer wasn't helpful. Who else would Mustard have called? Though that didn't explain why Midnight was in the street. If he'd won, he would have. Shit. That meant Mustard was probably inside and passed out. The idiot. If he'd known Midnight was there, why hadn't he called for backup? Dabi phoned Kurogiri, and once the League's warper had picked up, he put the phone back in his pocket. With this question, the warp villain would know what was needed. Dabi strode forward, reaching down to grab the back of Midnight's shirt and drag her towards Mustard's house. He was almost at the gate when it exploded outwards. Dabi might not have been in the news as a villain for the last few years, but he had kept up his training. He jumped back. The motion took the former hero with him, and he dropped her, covering both of his hands in blue flame as he raised them. He half expected to hear an alarm, but the area remained eerily quiet. Fucker. The expletive wasn't expected. Out of the dust caused by the explosion, someone Dabi hadn't expected to see walk through the ruins of the gate. He was dragging Mustard. Mustard was unconscious. His mouth was agape, and Dabi could see that the vigilante had knocked out his false teeth. Explodo kill, Dabi greeted the conscious man. The blonde glared at him before a vicious smile spread across the vigilante's face. Dabi, he replied. Just the man I wanted to see. Oh? He asked, raising one eyebrow, but not lowering his hands. The vigilante was fast, and with his explosive quirk, he was dangerous. Explodokill dumped Mustard's body, throwing it to the ground harshly, and he raised one hand, half mirroring Dabi's stance. Small explosions danced in his palm. Because you can tell me about your boss. Dabi snorted and held his ground, matching Explodokill's explosion with a burst of fire. Now, why would you want to know about him? He asked. According to Toga, Explodokill already knew about their boss. He could feel Kurogiri listening in, but the warp villain would wait for a signal before making his move. Besides, Imoko had said they could kill Explodokill, and what type of leader would he be if he didn't at least try? I want to know all about the fucker. Explodokill snarled. Dabi tossed a fireball back and forth between his hands. As it happens, the boss has an interest in you, he told the vigilante. That fucking Deku. Explodoking roared and drove forward again. The fire villain dodged to the side to avoid the blast, and then he extended one hand, trying to get a hit in on the vigilante's chest. He was well balanced, and managed to jerk back in time, though Dabi knew the heat of his quirk would have been felt. The vigilante leapt backwards, somersaulting back, and attempting to lash out with his feet. Dabi was a little jealous. He wasn't sure he could pull that move. Instead, he threw the fireball at Explodokill. The vigilante swatted it from the air, an exploding hand. Dabi didn't smile as he generated a new fireball. Again, he tossed it like a ball. The vigilante's eyes followed it, and Dabi generated another fireball, dropping this one quickly. You're gonna juggle? Explodokill mocked. Maybe, Dabi joked, generating more fireballs. He tossed them into the air, and did actually juggle a few before he flicked them towards the blonde. The first few he allowed the vigilante to swat away. It established a routine. Then one exploded as Explodokill tried to whack it. The vigilante hissed as the heat wave washed over him and jumped back from the other fireballs coming at him. Dabi snapped his fingers, exploding the others. He was used to the heat, but he knew the vigilante would have burns. Fucker, the curse confirmed his thought. Dabi created a new set of fireballs. They were his current favorite trick, and over the years, he had learned a thing or two about how to use his quirk. This time Explodokill was slightly more cautious, but the vigilante was determined to get him, and the vigilante knew how many times he'd slipped away via Ojiko's or Kurogiri's warp gates. He was probably suspicious of those. Explodokill narrowed his eyes, and then he raised his hands. He made an odd gesture, curling his fingers into a circle. Dabi was wary and felt a flash of concern when a concentrated explosion shot forth. It was almost like a laser. He hadn't been the only one to create new tricks over the years. The fire villain didn't like to, but he drove forward. To defeat the vigilante, all he had to do was get one hand on him. Then, flames did so like to spread. But Dabi knew that Explodokill wouldn't make it easy for him. The vigilante dodged, throwing several explosions in his way. They scored the white facing of the tall fences. The cul-de-sac was going to need a makeover by the time they were done. They traded blows, but both were well trained. Explodokill snarled, but Dabi knew better than to think it was because the vigilante was losing his cool. The man was just naturally angry. It was confirmed when Explodokill formed a fist. Dabi could feel the explosions within it. He countered with his own fire-covered hand, and there was a larger explosion when the two of them meet. The windows in the surrounding houses rattled. From the sound, a few shattered, but Dabi didn't have time to pay attention to that. Explodokill was grinning at him. That wasn't a good sign. Dabi knew the smiles of those who were addicted to combat. This was different. This was the smile of someone whose plans had come together. The vigilante moved. Dabi blinked. He was far faster than he had been, but before the fire villain could brace, he was pushed forward by an explosion. His eyes widened. Explodokill was still in front of him. How had the explosion come from behind? Then he was pushed to the side. Again, there was nothing there. Then there was. The vigilante was upon him, hitting hard. "I'm better than you," he hissed. "Stronger. Faster. Superior." Dabi gritted his teeth. He knew how to take a beating, even if he didn't like it. It was one of the lessons Daddy Dearest had literally beaten into him. He retaliated when he could, pushing out flames to ward off the worst of Explodokill's punches as he tried to work out how the vigilante had hit him from behind in the side. There was no reason. He cried out when something snapped. His arm. That hurt. Dabi leapt back, almost hitting the fence of one of the houses. Explodokill allowed the movement, his expression smug. Dabi stood, flexing his fingers slightly. His arm hurt, but he had to push past that, no matter how hard it was. A glance told him the skin was unbroken. That was something. It was a clean break. His eyes narrowed as he considered the problem. It wasn't his arm, it was Explodokill's quirk. If the vigilante could hit him from angles he couldn't cover, then he needed reinforcements. Mustard was still on the street where the blonde had dumped him, and no one in the league was quite ready for this. Kurogiri was ready, but the warp villain wouldn't fight. Which meant Midnight could be leverage. Maybe. It was worth trying. Especially with his arm. He had to at least make some strike against Explodokill before he retreated. "You aren't a very good vigilante, are you?" Dabi mocked. "All the vigilantes I've known have wanted to be heroes. You are just in it for the thrill of the fight." Explodokill glared at him through narrowed eyes but didn't deny it. "Even so, I would have thought you might give some consideration to your allies." Dabi lit up one hand and held it out towards the still unconscious former pro-hero. Explodokill snorted. There was no concern in his expression. Instead, he raised one hand, letting explosions pass over it before he tilted it backwards, straight at Mustard. "Bugger." The vigilante grinned. "I don't give a fuck about her." That was probably true, but Dabi had to get leverage somewhere. "I think you do," he scoffed. "You've been careful so far, not to kill. You know what would happen if you do," he added. Explodokill scowled. It was his default expression, but Dabi could see that he wasn't happy. There was a certain amount of truth in his words. Vigilantes weren't tolerated, but there were those who had survived for longer because they didn't rock the boat too much. Explodokill was relatively new. Explodokill wanted to shake the foundations. The government couldn't allow that. Even losing an election, the institution couldn't allow it, since they had to preserve the law. He might be a villain, but if you kill him, I think you will find his life has more worth than you thought. Dobby finished with a smile that was more of a grimace, given the pain from his arm. He didn't have to say the rest, that if he killed Midnight, it would just be written off as a villain attack. There might be a bit more searching for him, but Dobby had lived through campaigns like that before. He wasn't in Tartarus. He'd be laying low for a bit with his arm, anyway. The vigilante hissed. It was enough of an acknowledgement of Dobby's truth. I don't care, the blonde growled, and Mustard's body was rocked by several explosions. The vigilante hadn't moved. It was the same technique he'd used on Dobby earlier. The fire villain watched carefully. He still couldn't see how it was being done, but it didn't matter. In retaliation, he let out a small jet of flame. It hit Midnight, catching the midriff of her clothes and setting it alight. Dobby controlled the fire, not letting it spread. He wasn't some perv who needed to burn off women's clothing to get his jollies. The vigilante's expression didn't change. Instead, he allowed a few more explosions to shake Mustard's body. Dobby stared flatly, but he knew where this was going. He sent more fire towards the former pro hero. Kirojiri, Dobby whispered, knowing the warp villain was still listening. He'd know what the name meant. Let's finish this, fucker. Explodokill snarled. Yes, let's, Dobby agreed. He snapped the fingers of his good hand. A wall of fire appeared between them. Weakling, the vigilante cried and dove through the flames. Dobby expected that, and while it hurt like a bitch, he held up his broken arm, sending a gout of flame towards the vigilante. The man was wise enough to avoid it, but it did stop his charge. It gave Dobby time to send more fire towards the fallen pro hero. Oh, if that's the way you want it. Explodokill yelled. His hands pointed backwards and Dobby winced at the noise as explosions covered Mustard. The other villain didn't wake up, but nor had Midnight. Internally, Dobby sighed. That's the way it will be, he said, affecting an unconcerned tone. He really didn't want to lose another member of the league, but at least they would get Midnight as well. He increased the intensity of his fire. The smell of burning flesh filled the cul-de-sac. Fat and hair had an odd smell. It wasn't nice. He was used to it. From the expression on Explodokill's face, the vigilante wasn't. Kirojiri finally opened a portal. No, the vigilante screamed. Dobby smiled. He wished he'd done more, but he recognized reality and retreating was the better option, for now. You can deal with this, he told the blonde as he stepped back. Explodokill lunged towards him, both hands extended and throwing explosions towards him. Dobby raised his arms protectively over his body, groaning as the break pained him. He was going to pay for that. The pressure passed over him and then the warp closed around him and he was in the familiar surrounds of his office. Arg, he cried out, allowing himself to fully feel the pain in his arm. And from the places Explodokill had hit with his quirk. Kirojiri appeared. The man didn't say anything. Instead, he looked him over and Dobby was thankful when another small warp appeared over the table, disgorging a first aid kit. Fucking vigilante. Dobby growled. Mustard, the warp villain asked. Dobby shook his head as he opened the first aid supplies one-handed. He grabbed the painkillers, downing them quickly before he looked for a splint for his arm. At least the break was clean. Fucking Explodokill was waiting for him, Dobby explained. Did you kill him? Kirojiri asked. Dobby didn't glare, but the warp villain knew the answer to that. The fucker is strong, he admitted. I got Midnight, he told him. It will be a group effort, Kirojiri agreed. The warp villain rarely let his opinion be known, but Dobby thought the old league member was slightly disappointed. It was hard to tell. Next time, Dobby said, wincing as he splinted his arm. Kirojiri approached and took over the procedure. The warp villain was better at it anyway. Next time, Dobby repeated. Next time, Kirojiri agreed. Though possibly there won't be a next time, he added. Dobby looked at him sharply. The question obvious. The police won't take well to vigilantism, the warp villain said, reminding Dabi of what he had told Explodokill. We can hope, the fire villain agreed with a nod. He could hope, but while he knew what police procedure was, he didn't think it would be enough to stop Explodokill. Imoku was right. They had to kill him. They just needed the right opportunity. A fop. Former pro hero found dead. Aizawa swore at his newsfeed and clicked the article. It wouldn't be news unless there was something unusual about it. The leafy suburb of Cebu has been rocked by the discovery of 2 bodies. One has been positively identified as former pro hero Midnight. The other is an unidentified male, who is reportedly a resident of the area. He was found just outside his home. There was evidence of a fight, and both deaths are being treated as suspicious. Police are wanting to question the vigilante Explodokill in relation to the deaths. Shit. Shoyuta exploded. He didn't need to read anymore. He forwarded the article to Bakugo. It was his demand for an explanation. His phone beeped in response, far too quickly for his comfort. The mail is Mustard. And? Aizawa sent back. The explanation was not appropriate. It explained nothing, despite the fact that Bakugo obviously thought that it would. The boy was intelligent, but he often forgot that others did not share his base assumptions. The former pro hero glared at his phone. I was waiting for him to come home, came the further response. Aizawa began to have an inkling of what happened now. He didn't like his conclusions. The bastard didn't come in, so I went to investigate. Midnight was down. Looks like they gassed each other. Shoyuta blinked at the message, not sure what to think. They gassed each other? It was technically possible. But that didn't explain why Midnight was dead, especially if Bakugo was there. Maybe Mustard would have died, but Midnight should have received treatment. That doesn't explain their deaths. He sent the message. Dabi was there. Seriously, at times it was like pulling teeth to get information. Aizawa looked at the article again. There was no mention of the villain, and usually there would be. Dabi left no evidence, he noted. The bastard ran. That may be, but the police want you. He felt obligated to point out, as he deliberately took several calming breaths. He wasn't being paid enough to deal with this shit. Hell, he wasn't being paid to deal with Bakugo. They won't catch me. The boy was as cocky as ever. Aizawa knew he couldn't say much more. Katsuki wouldn't listen. Make sure of that. Kakaridi will influence charges, he told his former student. Probably Carrie too, he added. They won't. He seemed sure. Shoyuta knew that it was a facade and he left it. He had enough to think about now. Briefly he closed his eyes, thinking about Midnight. Her presence raised questions. What had she been doing? Had it been chance she'd encountered Mustard or something else? He sighed. Now he had another thing to look into. Maybe Sir Night-Eye knew. He hoped Sir Night-Eye knew. Aizawa had a feeling that All Might's former sidekick wouldn't. It was going to be a long few weeks. A fop. Imoku sat in the parliament. With an election called, and campaigning underway, the government was in caretaker mode, so he wasn't sure why they were in session. They were though, and he never missed a session. It wasn't any comfort that Yatarida, the opposition leader, didn't look pleased. He'd asked Masami what the purpose was, but the current foreign minister didn't know. She was seated near the bottom of the tiered room, her expression studiously neutral. It was probably just the prime minister wanting to show off his power. That was normal. Kiyoshi Takanaka had been acceptable as the deputy, but once he got to the chief position he had slowly become less reasonable. It was one of the reasons the public was disenchanted with the government. This particular stunt today was most likely one of his last opportunities to show off power. Imoku imagined once the election was lost, the party would elect a new leader. Maybe even Masami. That would be convenient for him, but he would think on that when it happened. His phone buzzed. It was set on silent, but Imoku pulled it out. There wasn't anything interesting happening, and the reporters who were ever present in the public gallery were almost asleep. No one would comment about him being on his phone, especially when Imoku could see several others tapping away. It was better to get some work done. He glanced at the message and froze. There's been an RFI on Biosimap. It wasn't much of a message, but there was a reason it had been sent to him. Because Biosimap was involved with the Justice Department, certain pieces of information had to be given to the public when it was requested. That's what the RFI was, a request for information. There had been a few after Carrie became known and he hadn't got a message. This one meant someone had requested specific, sensitive information. Who? Imoku typed back. PI Industries. Imoku frowned. He didn't recognize the name and he had a pretty good understanding of companies out there. He did a quick search. Nothing came up. Biosimap could reject the information request on the grounds that the company was a front, but that meant a legitimate company would be used next time. PI Industries. The obvious expansion to it was private investigator. Imoku smiled to himself. It would make sense, but who was the private investigator? Who signed the request? Imoku asked. That would tell him more. There was a delay as his contact no doubt checked. The agent knew to tell him immediately if there was a certain request. The details could follow. Kagurita Hyojo, came the response. Imoku didn't recognize the name, but he recognized the kanji. His informant was one of the quirkless people he had employed. This particular contact had been forced to pull out of school early due to the bullying, and her written language skills weren't the best. Still, she could read enough, and the answer as to who requested the information was obvious. He wasn't sure if his contact meant it, but she had used the kanji for dirty look with the name. And if it was dirty look requesting information from Biosimap, then it was an easy deduction as to who was really looking. Look equaled eye, and dirty could mean dark, which could also become night. So Sir Night-Eye, looking for PI Industries, which was probably something that was standing in for Mighty Industries. The only question was if All Might was involved. All Might still ran his company. The retired pro hero had reintegrated just like everyone else, but there was still a demand for posters and toys from the hero age. And Mighty Industries didn't just produce All Might merchandise. They had several contracts with movie studios. All Might was not a complete fool when it came to business, but Imoku knew Kunshu could take him. Except there had been no need. Mighty Industries did merchandise. That was all. They made a good income there, but they didn't trade in the same things Kunshu did, and up until now, there had been no conflict between the two companies. There was now. And he thought he knew why. His lips pressed together in a narrow line. He had told Biosimap to keep a stockpile of mustard sleeping gas, and to only use the oldest in making their premium brand pill. They hadn't. And now, the connection was too obvious. Mustard was dead, killed by Bakugo, or if he wanted, he could blame Dabi, except that was a thought for another day, and Biosimap had to announce they only had limited supplies of their premium brand. The coincidence would be lost on most, but it could be enough to point others in the right direction, especially with this request. He was going to have to check that other companies were obeying his instructions. But again, not today. So, with Sir Night-Eye looking into Biosimap, using a fake name that put a very different slant on the RFI. Sir Night-Eye would know about mustard. He would know about Biosimap. He might make the connection. You've done well, Imoku typed, and closed the message stream as he thought. He couldn't deny the RFI. Well, Biosimap couldn't, because that would invalidate the carry contract, and no doubt that was something Sir Night-Eye wanted. Though the former pro hero would know that was a long shot. What he could do though was make sure that Sir Night-Eye was buried in information. Biosimap had an RFI response pack. It didn't include the information requested this time, but it would be a delaying tactic. It would take them a few days, at least to realize that information wasn't just buried. The response would let Imoku know what they were truly searching for. There was nothing incriminating with the requested information, it was just commercially sensitive, and Biosimap had the right to protect their commercial advantage. And he had the right to shift the responsibility for employing Mustard, a known villain, to one of the executives. Yagi Keikan would do nicely. The others would then fall in line. Still, the information request was a warning. They were closing in. Imoku smiled, putting his phone away. No doubt Sir Night-Eye thought of himself as a hunter, tracking down the information required. He was willing to bet that the former pro hero had forgotten the first rule of the hunt. Gazelle never cornered the lion.
That's it for today. Remember to show your support to the creator of this story if you enjoyed it. If you would like more parts of the story to be uploaded, leave a comment and subscribe to get notified when the story continues. Bye-bye for now, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.